Hello and welcome to another stream, to another reading stream. Today, Call of Cthulhu, and a minute. Oh, I was gonna talk about the art before we started, but actually, I don't have much to say. Just the fact that I lined the art, and just how much of a difference that makes. Let's actually get those out of the way. That kind of killed the opening a little. Let's put the airy sketch down there, or drawing at this point. And God, how deep are we into Lovecraft at this point? We've read a bunch of short stories, but I believe this will be the longest thing we will have read from him so far. Because this is gonna take, I think, 2 streams to do at least. But we've done the Nameless City, we've done the Temple, we've done the Cat of Ulthar, or Ulth, I don't know what it's, Ulthar, I can't remember. We've done a lot of things. We've done the Hound, which was a fun one to read. But we're now here for probably his most famous work, The Call of Cthulhu. And, you know what? I think we'll just jump right into it. The Call of Cthulhu by H.P. Lovecraft. Of such great powers or beings, there may be conceivably a survival of a hugely remote period when consciousness was manifested, perhaps in shapes and forms long since withdrawn before the tide of advancing humanity, forms of which poetry and legend alone have caught a flying memory and called them gods, monsters, mythical beings of all sorts and kinds. Algernon Blackwood. Is that a real person? Oh, I'm reading Flowers for Algernon behind the scenes, and I always like to look for connections. Call of Cthulhu. Oh, that's a naked person. The ring of worshippers moved in endless bacchanale between the ring of bodies and the ring of fire. Chapter 1. The Horror in Clay. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all of its contents. We live in a placid island of ignorance, in a midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant to. It was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little. But some day the piecing together of disassociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality that, and of our frightful position therein, that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. The Theosophists have guessed at the awesome grandeur of the cosmic cycle wherein our world and the human race form transient incidents. They have inherited at strange survivals in terms which would freeze the blood if not masked by the bland optimism. But it is not from them that there came the single glimpse of forbidden aeons which chills me when I think of it and maddens me when I dream of it. The glimpse, like all dread glimpses of truth, flashes out from an accidental piecing together of separated things. In this case, an old newspaper item, and the notes of a dead professor. I hope that no one else will accomplish this piecing together. Certainly, if I live, I shall never knowingly supply a link in so hideous a chain. I think the professor, too, intended to keep silent regarding the part he knew, and he could have destroyed his notes had not sudden death seized him. There we go. Oh, wait a second. We're doing a reading stream. I need my glasses.
Can't read without my glasses.
Okay. My knowledge of the thing began in the winter of 1926-27 with the death of my granduncle, George Gamel Engel, Professor Emeritus of Semitic language in Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island. Professor Engel was widely known as an authority on ancient inscriptions and had frequently been resorted to by the heads of prominent museums, so that his passing at the age of 92 may be recalled by many. Locally, interest was intensified by the obscurity of the cause of death. The professor had been stricken whilst returning from the Newport boat, falling suddenly, as witnesses said, after having been jostled by a nautical-looking black man who had come from one of the queer dark courts of the precipitous hillside, which formed a short cut from the waterfront to the deceased's home in William Street. Physicians were unable to find any visible disorder, but concluded after perplexed debate that some obscure lesion of the heart induced by the brisk ascent of so steep a hill by so elderly a man was responsible for the end. At the time, I saw no reason to dissent from this dictum, but latterly I am inclined to wonder, and more than wonder. As my granduncle's heir and executor, for he died a childless widower, I was expected to go over his papers with some thoroughness, and for the purpose moved his entire set of files and boxes to my quarters in Boston. Much of the material which I correlated will be later published by the American Archaeological Society, but there was one box which I found exceedingly puzzling and which I felt much averse from showing to other eyes. It had been locked, and I did not find the keys till it occurred to me to examine the personal ring which the professor carried always in his pocket. Then indeed I succeeded in opening it, but when I did so seemed only to be confronted by a greater and more closely locked barrier. But what could be the meaning of the queer clay bas-relief and the disjoined jottings, ramblings, and cuttings which I found? Had my uncle in his latter years become credulous of the most superficial impostures? I resolved to search out the eccentric sculptor responsible for this apparent disturbance of an old man's peace of mind. The bas-relief was a rough rectangle less than an inch thick and about 5 by 6 inches in area, obviously of modern origin. Its design, however, were far from modern in atmosphere and suggestion, for although the vagaries of cubism and futurism are many and wild, they do not often reproduce that cryptic irregularity which lurks in prehistoric writing. And writing of some kind the bulk of these designs seemed certainly to be, though my memory, despite much familiarity with the papers and collections of my uncle, failed in any way to identify this particular species or even hint at its remote affiliations. Above these apparent hieroglyphics was a figure of evidently pictorial intent, though its impressionistic execution forbade a very clear idea of its nature. It seemed to be a sort of monster or symbol representing a monster of a form which only a diseased fancy could conceive. If I say that my somewhat extravagant imagination yielded simultaneous picture of an octopus, a dragon, and a human caricature, I shall not be unfaithful to the spirit of the thing. A pulpy, tentacled head surmounted a grotesque and scaly body with rudimentary wings. But it was the general outline of the whole which made it most shockingly frightful. Behind the figure was a vague suggestion of a cyclopean architectural background. The writing accompanying this oddity, aside from the stack of press cuttings in Professor Engel's most recent hand, and made no pretense to literary style, what seemed to be the main document was headed Cthulhu Cult, in character painstakingly printed to avoid the erroneous reading of the words so unheard of. This manuscript was divided into two sections, the first of which was headed 1925, Dream and Dream Work of H.A. Wilcox, 7 Thomas Street, Providence, Rhode Island. And the second, Narrative of Inspector John R. Legrasse, 121 Bienville Street, New Orleans, Louisiana, at 1908. I don't know what the AA means. Montgomery? Notes on same and Professor Webb's account. And the other manuscript papers were all brief notes. Some of them accounts of queer dreams of different persons. Some of them citations from the theosophical books and magazines, notably of W. Scott Eliot's Atlantis and the Lost Lemuria. And the rest comments on the long surviving secret society and hidden cults with references to the passages in such mythological and anthropological source books as Fraser's Golden Bough and Miss Murray's Witch Cult in the Western Europe. The cuttings largely alluded to outre mental illnesses and outbreaks of group folly or mania in the spring of 1925. The first half of the principal manuscript told a very peculiar tale. It appears that on March 1st, 1925, a thin, dark young man of necrotic and excited aspect had called upon neurotic and excited aspect had called upon Professor Engels, bearing the singular clay bas-relief, which was then exceedingly damp and fresh. His card bore the name of Henry Anthony Wilcox, and my uncle had recognized him as the youngest son of an excellent family slightly known to him who had latterly been studying the sculpture at the Rhode Island School of Design and living alone at the Fleur de Lis building near the institution. Wilcox was the precocious youth of known genius but great eccentricity, and had from childhood excited attention through the strange stories and odd dream he was in the habit of relating. He called himself physically hypersensitive, but the staid folk of the ancient commercial city dismissed him as merely queer, never mingling much with his kind. He had dropped gradually from the social visibility and was now known only to a small group of aesthetes from other towns. Even the Providence Art Club, anxious to preserve its conservatism, had found him quite hopeless. Let me check something real quick. Okay. As a double checking audio real quick. On the occasion of the visit, ran the professor's manuscripts. The sculptor abruptly asked for the benefit of his host's archaeological knowledge in identifying the hieroglyphic on the bas relief. He spoke of a dreamy, stilted manner which suggested pose and alienated sympathy, and my uncle showed some sharpness in replying, for the conspicuous freshness of the tablet implied kinship with anything but archaeology. Young Wilcox rejoined, which impressed my uncle enough to make him recall recall and record it verbatim, was of a fantastically poetic cast which must have typified his whole conversation, and which I have since found highly characteristic of him. He said, "It is new indeed, for I made it last night in a dream of strange cities, and dreams are older than brooding tear. For the contemplative sphinx, or garden-girdled Babylon." It was then that he began that rambling tale which suddenly played upon a sleeping memory and won the fevered interest of my uncle. There had been a slight earthquake tremor the night before, the most considerable felt in New England for some years, and Wilcox's imagination had been keenly affected. Upon retiring, he had an unprecedented dream of great cyclopean cities of Titan blocks and sky-flung monoliths, all dripping with green ooze and sinister with latent horror. Hieroglyphs had covered the walls and the pillars, and from some undetermined point below had come a voice that was not a voice, a chaotic sensation which only fancy could transmute into sound, but which he attempted to render by the almost unpronounceable jumble of letters, Cthulhu Fatagen. This verbal jumble was the key to the collection which excited and disturbed Professor Engel. He questioned the sculptor with scientific minuteness and studied with almost frantic intensity the bas-relief on which the youth had found himself working, chilled and clad only in his Sorry about that. In his night clothes, when waking had stolen bewildering over him, my uncle blamed his old age. Wilcox afterwards said, for his slowness in recognizing both hieroglyphs and pictorial design. Many of his questions seemed highly out of place to his visitor, especially those which tried to connect the latter with strange cults and societies. And Wilcox could not understand the repeated promises of silence which he was offered in exchange for the admission of membership in some widespread mystical or paganly religious body. When Professor Engel became convinced that the sculptor was indeed ignorant of any cult or system of cryptic lore, he besieged his visitor with demands for future reports of dreams. This bore regular fruit, for after the first interview, the manuscript records daily calls of the young man, during which he related startling fragments of nocturnal imagery, whose burden was always some terrible cyclopean vista of dark dripping stone, with a subterranean voice or intelligence shouting monotonously in the enigmatical sense impact inscribable save as gibberish. The two sounds most frequently repeated are those rendered by the letters Cthulhu and Relay. Hello, Opus. I am interdimensional god being. We're just finishing up the first chapter. Actually, no, wait. I don't know if this has chapters. It had the number 1, so certainly there's chapters. On March 23rd, the manuscript continued. Wilcox failed to appear, and inquiries at his quarters revealed that he had been stricken with an obscure sort of fever and taken to the home of his family in Watermain Street. He had cried out in the night, arousing several other artists in the building, and had manifested since then only in alternations of consciousness and delirium. My uncle at once telephoned the family, and from that time forward kept close watch of the case, calling often at the Thayer Street office of Dr. Toby, whom he learned to be in charge. The youth's febrile mind apparently was dwelling on strange things, and the doctor shuddered now and then as he spoke of them. They included not only repetition of what he had formerly dreamed, but touched wildly on the gigantic thing miles high, which walked or lumbered about. He at no time fully described this object, but occasional frantic words, as repeated by Dr. Toby, convinced the professor that it must be identical with the nameless monstrosity he had sought to depict on the dream sculpture. Reference to this object, the doctor added, was invariably a prelude to the young man's subsidence into lethargy. His temperature, oddly enough, was not greatly above normal, but the whole condition was otherwise such as to suggest true fever rather than mental disorder. On April 2nd, at about 3 p.m., every trace of Wilcox's malady suddenly ceased. He sat upright in bed, astonished to find himself at home and completely ignorant of what had happened in dream or reality since the night of March 22nd. Pronounced well by his physician, he returned to his quarters in 3 days, but to Professor Engels he was of no further assistance. All traces of strange dreaming had vanished with his recovery. My uncle kept no record of his night thoughts after a week of pointless and irrelevant accounts of thoroughly unusual visions. Is it a bad thing to note that this year I got sick on March 21st and got well on like April 3rd? That's a hell of a coincidence. I got real sick and I got really delirious while I was sick too. I think I had to cancel stream for like both weeks. Oddly, I did not see Cthulhu, but I did see an angel. Metaphorically speaking. Here, the first part of the manuscript ended. But reference to certain of the scattered notes gave me much material for thought. So much, in fact, that only the ingrained skepticism then forming my philosophy can account for my continued distrust of the artist. The notes in question were those descriptive of the dreams of various persons covering the same period as that in which the young Wilcox had his strange visitations. My uncle, it seemed, had quickly instituted a prodigiously far-flung body of inquiries among nearly all the friends whom he could question without impertinence, asking for nightly reports of their dreams and the dates of any notable visions for some time past. The reception of his request seemed to have been varied, but he must, at the very least, have received more responses than any ordinary man could have handled without a secretary. This original correspondence was not preserved, but his notes formed a thorough and really significant digest. Average people in society and business, New England's traditional salt of the earth, gave an almost completely negative result, though scattered cases of uneasy but formless nocturnal impressions appear here and there, always between March 23rd and April 2nd. This is a coincidence, chat. The period of young Wilcox's delirium. Scientific men were little more affected, though 4 cases of vague description suggest fugitive glimpses of strange landscapes. And in one case, there is mentioned a dread of something abnormal. Give me a half pause while I turn on my fan. Nice airflow, because the air is just dead as hell in here. It was from the artists and poets that the pertinent answers came, and I know that panic would have broken loose had they been able to compare notes. As it was lacking their original letters, I half suspected the compiler of having asked leading questions or of having edited the correspondence in corroboration of what he had latently resolved to see. That is why I continued to feel that Wilcox somehow cognizant, of the old data which my uncle had possessed had been imposing on the veteran scientist. These responses from the estates told a disturbing tale. From February 28th to April 2nd, a large portion of them had dreamed of very bizarre things, and intensity of the dreams being immeasurably the stronger during the period of the sculptor's delirium. Over a fourth of those who reported anything reported scenes and half sounds not unlike those which Wilcox had described, and some of the dreams confessed acute fear of gigantic nameless thing visible towards the last. One case which the note describes with emphasis was very sad. The subject, a widely known architect, with leaning towards theosophy, and occultism, went violently insane on the date of the young Wilcox seizure and expired several months later after incessant screaming to be saved from some escaped denizen of hell. Had my uncle referred to these cases by name instead of merely by number, I should have attempted some corroboration and personal investigation, but as it was, I succeeded in tracing down only a few. All of these, however, bore out notes in full. I have often wondered if all the objects of the professor's questioning felt puzzled at as did this fraction. It is well that no explanation shall ever reach them. The press cutting, as I intimated, touched on cases of panic, mania, and eccentricity during the given period. Professor Engel must have employed a cutting bureau, for the number of extractions was tremendous, and the sources scattered throughout the globe. Here was a nocturnal self-termination in London, where a lone sleeper had leaped from the window after a shocking cry. Here, likewise, a rambling letter of an editor of a paper in South America, where a fanatic deduces a dire future from visions he had seen. A dispatch from California describes a theosophist, that's well, that word's gonna trip me up this whole time, colony as donning white robes en masse for some glorious fulfillment, which never arrives, whilst items from India speak guardedly. Sorry. Guardedly of serious native unrest toward the end of March. Voodoo orgies multiply in Haiti, and African outposts report ominous mutterings. American officers in the Philippines find certain tribes bothersome about this time, and New York policemen are mobbed by hysterical Levantines on the night of March 22nd and March 23rd. The west of Ireland, too, is full of wild rumor and legendary and fantastic painter named Ardu Bonnet hangs a blasphemous dream landscape in the Paris Spring Salon of 1926, and so numerous are the recorded troubles of insane asylums that only a miracle can have stopped the medical fraternity from noting strange parallelism and drawing mystified conclusions. A weird bunch of cutting, all told, and I can at this date scarcely envisage the callous rationalism with which I set them aside. But I was then convinced that young Wilcox had known of the old matters mentioned by the professor. I'm sorry, with all the talking of, I'm gonna use the break in the chapter to talk real quick. With all the ravings in between, so all the ravings increasing over that time, of all the things I thought of In the Mouth of Madness, and I kind of just realized, I don't know if In the Mouth of Madness is a Cthulhu story, or if it's a King in Yellow story. It's an Eldritch horror. It's actually a very good Eldritch horror. It's a John Carpenter film. It's one of his last in the 90s. But if you haven't seen it and you like Eldritch horror, I would recommend In the Mouth of Madness. It has the guy from Jurassic Park who plays Grant, the paleontologist who hates kids and likes kids by the end of the film. It has him, and he's pretty much the author of the equivalent of the King in Yellow in the story. And it just shows both him and society going insane. He's not the author, sorry. He's charged with finding the author of like a story that's like the King in Yellow. Because the author's missing and they need to find him to get the book. and I forget what the story is called in the Mouth of Madness, but he's an investigator who has to just go out and find this guy because they need like the manuscript to publish the book, and it shows through his perspective the fall of like kind of society around him and his own slip into insanity. Cthulhu ASMR. Is it Cthulhu for Targan or Cthulhu for Tyne? I really can't remember, cause I'm not in my right mind since I met you. No one corrupts the way you do. Also, if you haven't listened to Hey There Cthulhu, a parody of Hey There Delilah, very funny song. But let us begin the next chapter and welcome Ivan. The Tale of Inspector Legrasse, whatever. It's French, I don't know. If it's not Fleur de Lis, I cannot say it correctly. The older matters which had made the sculptor's dream and bas-relief so significant to my uncle formed the subject of the second half of the long manuscript. Once before it appeared, Professor Engel had seen the hellish outlines of the nameless monstrosity, puzzled over the unknown hieroglyphs, and heard the ominous syllables which can be rendered only as Cthulhu. Or was it Cthulhu? Whatever. And all this in so stirring and horrible a connection that it is small wonder he pursued young Wilcox with queries and demands for data. This earlier experience had come in 1908, 17 years before, when the American Archaeological Society held its annual meeting in St. Louis. It's Louisville, it's St. Louis, Merrick. Okay. Professor Engel had, as befitted one of his authority and attainment, I hate that. It's good in writing. It's one of those like the worst things ever, because you always mistake it. Had a prominent part in all the deliberations and was one of the first to be approached by the several outsiders who took advantage of the convocation to offer questions for correct answering and problems for expert solution. The chief amongst these outsiders, and in a short time the focus of interest for the entire meeting, was a commonplace-looking middle-aged man who had traveled all the way from New Orleans for certain special information unobtainable from any local source. His name was John Raymond Legrasse, and he was by profession an inspector of police. With him he bore the subject of his visit, a grotesque, repulsive, and apparently very ancient stone statuette whose origin he was at a loss to determine. It must not be fancied that Inspector Legrasse had the least interest in archaeology. On contrary, his wish for enlightenment was prompted by purely professional consideration. The statuette, idol, fetish, or whatever it was, had been captured some months before in wooded swamps of New Orleans during a raid on a supposed voodoo meeting. And so, singularly and hideously, were the rites connected with it, and the police could not but realize that they had stumbled on a dark cult totally unknown to them, and infinitely more diabolical than even the blackest of the African voodoo circles. Of its origin, apart from the erratic and unbelievable tales extorted from the captured members, absolutely nothing was to be discovered. hence the anxiety of the police for any antiquarian lore which might help them to place the frightful symbol, and through it track down the cult to its fountainhead. Inspector Legrasse was scarcely prepared for the sensation which his offerings created. One sight of the thing had been enough to throw the assembled men of science into a state of tense excitement, and they lost no time in crowding around him to gaze at the diminutive figure whose utter strangeness and air of genuinely abysmal antiquity hinted so potently at unopened and archaic vistas. No recognized school of sculpture had animated this terrible object, yet centuries and even thousands of years seemed recorded in its dim greenish surface of unplaceable stone. The figure, which was finally passed slowly from man to man for close and careful study, was between 7 and 8 inches in height, and of exquisitely artistic workmanship. It represented a monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head whose face was a mass of feelers. A scaly, rubbery-looking body, prodigious claws on hind and fore feet, and long, narrow wings behind. This thing, which seemed instinct with a fearsome and unnatural malignancy, was of a somewhat bloated corpulence, and squatted evilly on a rectangular block of pedestal covered with undecipherable characters. The tips of the wings touched the back edge of the block, and the seat occupied the center, whilst the long curved claws of the doubled up crouching hind legs gripped the front edge and extended a quarter of the way down toward the bottom of the pedestal. The cephalopod head was bent forward so that the ends of the facial feelers brushed the backs of the huge forepaws, which clasped to the croucher's elevated knees. The aspect of the whole was abnormally lifelike and more subtle, fearful, because its source was so totally unknown. Its vast, awesome, and incalculable age was unmistakable, yet not one link did it show with any known type of art belonging to civilization's youth, or indeed to any other time. Totally separate, and upon its very material was mystery. For the soapy greenish black stone with its golden and iridescent flecks of striations resembled nothing familiar to geology or mineralogy. The characters along the base were equally baffling, and no member present, despite a representation of half the world's expert learning in the field, could form the least notion of even their remotest linguistic kinship. They, like the subject and material, belonged to something horribly remote and distinct from mankind as we know it, something frightfully suggestive of old and unhallowed cycles of life in which our world and our conceptions have no part. I should do a watch along with In the Mouth of Madness now that I think about it. It's probably the best, it's my favorite Eldritch movie I've seen. And yet, as the members severely shook their heads and confessed defeat in the inspector's problem, there was one man in the gathering who suspected a touch of bizarre familiarity in the monstrous shape and writing, and who presently told with some diffidence of the odd trifle he knew. This person was the late William Channing Webb. Thought it was going to be Channing Tatum. A professor of anthropology in Princeton University, and an explorer of no slight note. Professor Webb had been engaged 48 years before in a tour of Greenland and Iceland in search of some runic inscriptions which he failed to unearth. And whilst high upon the West Greenland coast had encountered a singular tribe of cult of degenerate Eskimos whose religion, a curious form of devil worship, chilled him with its deliberate bloodthirstiness and repulsiveness. It was a faith of which other Eskimos knew little, and which they mentioned only with shudders, saying it had come down from horribly ancient eons before ever the world was made. Besides nameless rites and human sacrifices, there were certain queer hereditary rituals addressed to the supreme elder devil or Tornasok, and of this Professor Webb had taken a careful phonic copy from the age Angekok, or wizard priest, expressing the sounds in Roman letters as best he knew how. But just now of prime significance was the fetish which this cult had cherished, and around which they danced when the aurora leaped high over the ice cliffs. It was, the professor stated, a very crude bas-relief of stone, comprising a hideous picture and some cryptic writing. And as far as he could tell, it was a rough parallel in all essential features of the bestial thing now lying before the meeting. The data received with suspense and astonishment by assembled members proved doubly exciting to Inspector Legrasse, and he began at once to ply this informant with questions, having noted and copied an oral ritual among the swamp cult worshippers his men had arrested. He besought the professor to remember as best he might the syllables taken down amongst the diabolical Eskimos. There then followed an exhaustive comparison of details and a moment of really odd silence. Then both detective and scientist agreed on the virtual identity of the phrase common to two hellish rituals so many worlds of distances apart. What in substance both Eskimo wizards and Louisiana swamp priests had chanted to their kindred idols was something very like this, the word division being guessed at from traditional breaks in phrase as chanted aloud. Funglui Minglachnach Cthulhu Relay Wagnagal Fathagen. Legrasse had 1 point in advance of Professor Webb, for several among his mongrel prisoners had repeated to him that old celebrants had told them the words meant. This text, as given, ran something like this: "In his house of Relay, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming." Gonna pause before this next part. Apologies for that. It's one of those days where just the moment I start reading, my sinuses kick up. Don't know why that happens sometimes. And now, in response to a general urgent demand, the Inspector Legrasse related as fully as possible his experience with the swamp worshippers, telling a story to which I could see my uncle attached profound significance. It savored on the wildest dreams of mythmaker and theosophists, and disclosed an astonishing degree of cosmic imagination among such half-castes and pariahs as might be least expected to possess it. On November 1st, 1907, there had come to New Orleans police a frantic summons from the swamp and lagoon country to the south. The squatters there, mostly primitive but good-natured descendants of Lafitte's men, were in the grip of stark terror from an unknown thing which had stolen upon them in the night. It was voodoo, apparently some voodoo of a more terrible sort than they had ever known, and some of their women and children had disappeared since the malevolent tom-tom had begun the incessant beating far within the black haunted woods where no dweller ventured. There were insane shouts and harrowing screams, soul-chilling chants and dancing devil flames, and the frightened messenger added, the people could stand it no more. So a body of 20 police filling 2 carriages and an automobile had set out in the late afternoon with the shivering squatter as a guide. At the end of the passable road, they alighted and for miles splashed on in silence through the terrible cypress woods, where the day never came. Ugly roots and malignant hanging nooses of Spanish moss beset them, and now and then a pile of dank stones or fragments of rotting wall intensified by its hint of morbid habitation, a depression which every malformed tree and every fungus isolate combined to create at length the squatter's settlement, a miserable huddle of huts hove in sight. And hysterical dwellers ran out to cluster around the group of mobbing lanterns. A muffled beat of tom-toms was now faintly audible far, far ahead, and curdling shriek came at infrequent intervals when the wind shifted. A reddish glare, too, seemed to filter through the pale undergrowth beyond the endless avenue of forest night, reluctant even to be left alone again. Each one of the cowed squatters refused point blank to advance another inch towards the scene of unholy worship. So Inspector Legrasse and his 19 colleagues plunged on unguided into black arcades of horror, and none of them had ever trod before. The region now entered by the police was one traditionally evil repute, substantially unknown and untraversed by white men. There were legends of a hidden lake unglimpsed by mortal sight, in which dwelt a huge, formless white polypus thing with luminous eyes and Squatters whispered that bat-winged devils flew up out of the caverns in inner earth to worship it at midnight. They said it had been there before Iberville, before La Salle, before the Indians, and before even the wholesome beasts and birds of the woods. It was nightmare itself, and to see it was to die. But it made men dream, and so they knew enough to keep away. The present voodoo orgy was indeed on the merest fringe of this abhorred area, but that location was bad enough, hence perhaps that the very place of the worship had terrified the squatters more than the shocking sounds and incidents. Only poetry or madness could do justice to the noises heard by Legrasse's men as they plowed through the black morass towards the red glare and the muffled tom-toms. There are vocal qualities peculiar to men and vocal qualities peculiar to beasts, and it is terrible to hear the one who the source should yield the other. Animal fury and orgiastic license here worshipped themselves to demoniac heights by howls and squawking ecstasies that tore and reverberated through those nighted woods like pestilential tempests from the gulfs of hell. Now and then the less organized ululations would cease, and from that seemed well-drilled chorus of hoarse voices would rise in a sing-song chant that hideous phrase or ritual, Finglui McLaughlin Cthulhu relay Wagnachan Fatagan. Then the men, having reached a spot where the trees were thinner, came suddenly in sight of the spectacle itself. 4 of them reeled, 1 fainted, and 2 were shaken into frantic cry, which the mad cacophony of the orgy fortunately deadened. Legrasse dashed swamp water on the faces of the frightened men, and all stood trembling and nearly hypnotized in horror. In the natural glade of the swamp stood a grassy island of perhaps an acre's extent, clear of trees and tolerably dry. On this now leaped and twisted a more indescribable horde of human abnormality than any but a cyme or an Angarola could paint. Void of clothing, this hybrid spawn were braying, bellowing, and writhing about a monstrous ring-shaped bonfire, in the center of which, revealed by occasional rifts in the curtain of flames, stood great granite monolith some 8 feet in height, on top of which, incongruous in its diminutiveness, rested the noxious craven statuette. From a wide circle of 10 scaffolds set up at regular intervals with the flame-girt monolith as a centered hung head downward, and oddly marred bodies of the helpless squatters who had disappeared. It was inside this circle that the ring of worshippers jumped and roared in general direction of the mass motion being from left to right and endless, I hate that word, bacchanal between the ring of bodies and ring of fire. Then Johnny Cash walked out and it all started to make sense. Sorry. It may have been only imagination, and it may have been only echoes which induced one of the men in excitable Spaniard to fancy he heard antiphonal responses to the ritual from some far and unillumined spot deeper within the woods of ancient legendary horror. This man, Joseph D. Galvez, I later met and questioned, and he proved distractingly imaginative. He indeed went so far as to hint of the faint beating of a great wings and of a glimpse of shining eyes and a mountainous white bulk beyond the remotest trees. But I suppose he had been hearing too much native superstition, or watching night on Bald Mountain. Actually, the horrified pause of the men was of comparatively brief duration. Duty came first, and although there must have been nearly 100 mongrel celebrants in the throng, the police relied on their firearms and plunged determinedly into the nauseous route. For 5 minutes, the resultant din and chaos were beyond description. Wild blows were struck, shots were fired, and escapes were made. But in the end, Legrasse was able to count some 47 sullen prisoners, whom he forced to dress in haste and fall into line between 2 rows of policemen. 5 of the worshippers lay dead, and 2 severely wounded. Two severely wounded ones were carried away on improvised stretchers by their fellow prisoners. The image on the monolith was, of course, was carefully removed and carried back by Legrasse. Examined at the headquarters after a trip of intense strain and weariness, the prisoners all proved to be men of very low, mixed-blooded, and mentally abhorrent type. Most were seamen and sprinklings of blacks and... Is that mixed race? Is that what mulattoes mean? Largely West Indians or Bravo... Oh, no. I guess Indians, natives, whatever. Largely West Indians or Brava Portuguese from the... Latinos? Is that what he means? From the Cape Verde Islands, gave the coloring of voodooism to the heterogeneous cult. But before many questions were asked, it became manifest that something far deeper and older than black fetishism was involved. Degraded and ignorant as they were, the creatures held with surprise consistency to the central idea of their lonesome faith. They worshipped, so they said, the great old ones, who lived ages before there were any men and who came to the young world out of the sky. Those old ones were gone now inside the earth and under the sea, but their dead bodies had told their secrets and dreams to the first man, who formed a cult which had never died. This was that cult, and the prisoner said it had always existed and always would exist, hidden in distant wastes and dark places all over the world until the time when the great priest Cthulhu, from his dark house in the mighty city of Relay under the waters, should rise and bring the earth again beneath his sway. Someday he would call, when the stars were ready, and the secret cult would always be waiting to liberate him. Meanwhile, no more must be told. There was a secret which even torture could not extract. Mankind was not absolutely alone among the conscious things of Earth, for shapes came out of the dark to visit the faithful few. But these were not the great old ones. No man had ever seen the old ones. The carven idol was great Cthulhu, but none might say whether or not the others were precisely like him. No one could read the old writings now, but things were told by the word of mouth. The chanted ritual was not the secret. That was never spoken aloud, only whispered. The chantment only this: in his house at Relay, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. Only 2 of the prisoners were found sane enough to be hanged. The rest were committed to various institutions. All denied a part of the ritual murders and averted that the killings had been done by black-winged ones, which had come to them from their immemorable meetings place in the haunted wood. But of those mysterious allies, no coherent account could ever be gained. What the police did extract came mainly from the immensely aged mestizo named Castro. He claimed to have sailed to strange ports and talked with undying leaders of cults in mountains of China. Old Castro, remembered bits of hideous legend that paled the speculations of theosophists and made man and the world seem recent and transient indeed. There had been eons when other things ruled the earth, and they had great cities. Remains of them, he said, the deathless Chinaman had told him, were still to be found as cyclopean stones on islands in the Pacific. They all died vast epochs of times before man came. But there were arts which could revive them. When the stars had come round again to the right positions in the cycle of eternity, they had indeed come themselves from the stars and brought their images with them. These great old ones, Castro continued, were not composed altogether of flesh and blood. They had shape, for did not this star-fashioned image prove it? But that shape was not made of matter. When the stars were right, they could plunge from the world to world through the sky. But when the stars were wrong, they could not live. But although they no longer lived, they would never really die. They all lay in stone houses in their great city of Relay, preserved by the spells of mighty Cthulhu for a glorious resurrection when the stars and the earth might once more be ready for them. But at that time some force from outside must serve to liberate their bodies. The spell that preserved them intact likewise prevented them from making an initial move, and they could only lie awake in the dark and think whilst uncounted millions of years rolled by. They knew all that was occurring in the universe, for their mode of speech was transmitted thought. Even now they talked in their tunes. When, after infinities of chaos, the first men came, the great old ones spoke to the sensitive among them by molding their dreams, for only thus could their language reach the fleshy minds of mammals. Then whispered Castro, those first men formed the cult around small idols which the great one showed them, idols brought in dim eras from dark stars. That cult could never die till the stars came right again, and the secret priest would take great Cthulhu from his tomb to revive his subjects and resume his rule of Earth. The time would be easy to know, for then mankind would have become as great old ones, free and wild and beyond good and evil, with laws and morals thrown aside, and all men shouting and killing and reveling in joy. Then the liberated ones would teach them new ways to shout and kill and revel and enjoy themselves, and all the earth would flame with holocaust of ecstasy and freedom. Meanwhile, the cult, by appropriate rites, must keep alive the memory of those ancient ways and shadows forth the prophecy of their return. In the elderly time, chosen men had walked with the entombed old ones in dreams, but then something happened. The great stone city of Relay, with its monoliths and sepulchres, had sunk beneath the waves, and the deep waters, full of one primal mystery through which not even thought can pass, had cut off the spectral intercourse. But memory never died, and high priests said that the city would rise again when the stars were right. Then came out of the earth the black spirits of earth. Wait, oh no. Then came would never die, and the high priest city. Oh yeah. Then came out of the earth the black spirits of earth, moldly and shadowy, and full of dim rumors picked up in caverns beneath forgotten sea bottoms. But of them old Castro dared not speak much. He cut himself off hurriedly, and no amount of persuasion or subtlety could elicit more in this direction. The size of the old ones, too, he curiously declined to mention. Of the cult he said he had taught, the center lay amid the pathless deserts of Arabia, where Iram, the city of pillars, dreams hidden and untouched. It was not allied to the European witch cult, and was virtually unknown beyond its members. No book had ever really hinted of it, though the deathless Chinaman said that there were double meanings in the Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, which the initiated might read as they close, especially the much discussed couples. We're gonna have to talk about that when we get to this break. That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons even death may die. Legrasse, deeply impressed and not a little bewildered, had inquired in vain concerning an historic affiliation of the cult. Castro apparently had told the truth when he said it was wholly secret. The authorities at the Tulane University could shed no light upon either cult or image, and now the detective had come to the highest authorities in the country and met with no more than the Greenland tale of Professor Webb. Sorry, the reason I got excited there is because when they were talking about the city in the desert, I was like, oh, like the Nameless City, but I don't think the Nameless City ever got a name because it's the Nameless City. But then Abdul Azred is the mad Arab who, yeah, the mad Arab, as it says here, who the city was known from, who, you know, the reports of the city came from. So I like that tie-in. And in the Nameless City, what you had was pretty much a society waiting to be reawakened. You had a society that had died out during the rise of man and was just waiting to come back. Though where Relay had fallen beneath the sea, this city was at the sea and rose up into a desert. So I like that callback. I like that connective tissue. The feverish interest aroused at the meeting by Legrasse's tale corroborated, as it was by the statuette, is echoed in the subsequent correspondence of those who attended, although scant mention occurs in the formal publication of the society. Caution is the first care of those accustomed to face occasional charlatanry. I can read. And imposture. Legrasse for some time lent the image to Professor Webb, but at the latter's death it was returned to him and remains in his possession, where I viewed it not long ago. It is truly a terrible thing and unmistakably akin to the dream sculpture of young Wilcox. That my uncle was excited by the tale of this sculpture, I did not wonder, for what thoughts must arise upon hearing after a knowledge of what Legrasse... Is my head on? Yes. Legrasse was learned of the cult, of the sensitive young man who had dreamed not only the figure and exact hieroglyphs of the swamp found image and the Greenland devil tablet, but had come in his dreams upon at last 3 of the precise words of the formula uttered alike by Eskimo, diabolists, and mongrel Louisianans. Professor Engel's instant start on the investigation of the utmost thoroughness was eminently natural, though privately I suspected young Wilcox to have heard of the cult in some indirect way, of having invented a series of dreams to heighten and continue the mystery at my uncle's expense. The dream narrative and cuttings collected by the professor were, of course, strong corroboration. But the rationalism of my mind and the extravagance of the whole subject led me to adopt what I thought the most sensible conclusion. So after thoroughly studying the manuscript again, and correlating the theosophical, and anthropological notes, notes with the cult narrative of Legrasse, I made a trip to Providence to see the sculptor and give him a rebuke I thought proper of a boldly imposing upon the learned and aged man. Wilcox still lived alone in Fleur de Lys building in Thomas Street, a hideous Victorian imitation of 17th century Breton architecture, which flaunts its secured front amidst the lovely colonial houses on the ancient hill. You know what? I'm gonna make all of you sad. All of these houses, Victorian and colonial, they don't exist anymore. They were torn down for multifamily housing. It's Rhode Island. With that sad note, I know it's fictional, but in real life, those houses would not exist anymore. Under the very shadow of the finest Georgian steeple in America, I found him at work in his rooms, and at once conceded from the specimens scattered about that his genius is indeed profound and authentic. He will, I believe, be be heard from sometimes as one of the great decadents, for he has crystallized in clay and in one day mirror in marble those nightmares and fantasies which Arthur uh, McKen evokes in prose, and Clark Ashton Smith makes visible in verse and in painting. Dark, frail, and somewhat unkempt in aspect, he turned languidly at my knock and asked me my business without rising. When I told him who I was, he displayed some interest, for my uncle had excited his curiosity in probing his strange dreams, yet had never explained the reason for the study. I did not enlarge his knowledge in the regard, but sought with some subtlety to draw him out. In a short time I became convinced of his absolute sincerity, for he spoke of the dreams in the manner none could mistake. They and their subconscious residuum had influenced his art profoundly, and he showed me a morbid statue whose contours almost made me shake with potency of its black suggestion. He could not recall having seen the original of this thing except in his own dream bas relief, but the outlines had formed themselves insensibly under his hands. It was no doubt the giant shape he had raved in his delirium, and he really knew nothing of the hidden cult save from what my uncle's relentless catechisms had let fall. He soon made clear, and again I strove to think of some way in which he could possibly have received the weird impressions. He talked of his dream in a strangely poetic fashion, making me see with terrible vividness the damp cyclopean city of slimy green stone, whose geometry he oddly said was all wrong. And here with frightful expectancy the ceaseless half-mental calling from underground Cthulhu Fatagan. These words were formed part of that dread ritual which told of dead Cthulhu's dream vigil in his stone vault at Relay. I felt deeply moved despite my rational beliefs. Wilcox, I was sure, I'm sure, had heard of the cult in some casual way and had soon forgotten it amidst the mass of his equally weird reading and imagining. Lately, my virtue of its sheer impressiveness, it had found subconscious expression in dreams, in the bas-relief and in terrible statue I now beheld, so that his imposture upon my uncle had been a very innocent one. The youth was of a type at once slightly affected and slightly ill-mannered, which I could never like, but I was willing enough now to admit both his genius and his honesty. I took leave of him amicably, and wish him all the success his talent promises. The matter of the cult still remained to fascinate me, and at times I had visions of personal fame from researches into the origin and connection. I visited New Orleans, talked with Legrasse and others of the old-time raiding party, saw the frightful image, and even questioned such of the mongrel prisoners as still survived. Old Castro, unfortunately, had been dead for some years, which I now heard so graphically at first hand, though it was really no more than a detailed confirmation of what my uncle had written. excited me afresh, for I felt I felt sure that I was on the track of a very real, very secret, and very ancient religion whose discovery would make me an anthropologist of note. My attitude was still one of absolute materialism, as I wish it still were. And I discounted with almost inexplicable perversity the coincidence of the dream notes and the odd cuttings collected by Professor Angle. One thing which I began to suspect, which I now fear I know, is that my uncle's death was far from natural. He fell on a narrow hill street leading up from an ancient waterfront swarming with foreign mongrels. After a careless push from a black sailor, I did not forget the mixed blood and marine pursuits of the cult members in Louisiana, and would not be surprised to learn of secret methods and poison needles as ruthless and as anciently known as the cryptic rites and beliefs. Legrasse and his men, it is true, have been let alone, but in Norway a certain seaman who saw things and is dead. Might not the deeper inquiries of my uncle after encountering the sculptor's data have come a sinister year? I think Professor Angle died because he knew too much, or because he was likely to learn too much. Whether I shall go as he did remains to be seen, for I have learned much now. Well, that's paranoia. A 92-year-old man died. It must not have been natural. Hey, out of like dozens of people, one other person died on the other side of the globe. That confirms it. So we're starting to get a little bit of the madness seeping in. We're starting to get a bit of the insanity. I'm just going to check how much... If there's just one chapter left, I'm just going to read it. Oh, yeah, Doesn't even look like it's that long of a chapter, too. Okay, but I'm going to do a BRB because I'm going to get something so that my brain won't crash out in the middle of this chapter. So if you'll humor me for a moment, I'm going to be... Ooh, take a minute. Where's my BRB button? I so rarely hit it. Yay! Okay. And I'm also going to get up on Media Player some music for you guys. Let's get you some while I am going to get some food and whatnot. I'm gonna give you... No, that's not correct. I'm gonna give you some of the new classical music. Okay, I'll be right back. Just gonna get some... I'm not sure what I'm gonna get good, but I'm gonna get something so I make sure I don't crash out. And we are back. Let's get the BRB away so we can continue reading. Oh, and let us quickly turn. I don't even know if it's really audible for you guys. Let's turn the background storm back on. Let me take a drink, and we're just going to jump into the final chapter. Cthulhu, The Call of Cthulhu, Chapter 3. The Madness from the Sea. If heaven ever wishes to grant me a boon, it will be a total effacing of the results of the mere chance which fixed my eye on a certain stray piece of shelf paper. It was nothing on which I would naturally have stumbled in the course of my daily round, for it was an old number of an Australian journal, Sydney Bulletin, for April 18th, 1925. It had escaped even the cutting bureau, which had at the time of its issuance been avidly collecting material from my uncle's research. I just realized that whenever you come back from BRB, you should double check all your audios. Bye-bye. Okay. I had largely given over my iniquities into what Professor Engel called the Cthulhu cult, and was visiting a learned friend of Paterson, New Jersey, the curator of a local museum, and a mineralogist of note. Examining one day the reserve of specimens roughly set on the storage shelves in the rear room of the museum, my eyes were caught by an odd picture in one of the old papers spread beneath the store. It was the Sydney Bulletin I have mentioned, for my friend was wide affiliations in all conceivable foreign parts. The picture was half-tone cut of hideous stone image, almost identical with that which Legrasse had found in the swamp. Eagerly clearing the sheets of its pristine contents, I scanned the item in detail and was disappointed to find it of only moderate length. What it suggested, however, was of portentous significance to my flagging quest, and I carefully tore it out for immediate action. It read as follows: Mystery derelict found at sea. Vigilant arrives with the helpless armed New Zealand yacht in tow. One survived and dead men found aboard. Tale of desperate battle and death at sea. Rescued seamen refused particulars of strange experience. Odd idol found in his possession. Inquiry to follow. The Morrison Company's freighter Vigilant, bound from Valparaiso, arrived this morning at its wharf in Darling Harbor, having in tow the battered and disabled but heavily armed steam yacht Alert on Dunedin, New Zealand. Or is it Dunedin or Dunedin? Whatever. Which was sighted April 12th in south latitude 34 by 21, west latitude 152nd degrees by 17 measures, with one living and one dead man aboard. The Vigilant left Valparaiso March 25th, and on April 2nd was driven considerably south to her course by exceptionally heavy storms and monstrous waves. On April 12th, the derelict was sighted and, though apparently deserted, was found upon boarding to contain one survivor in a half-delirious condition and one man who had evidently been dead for more than a week. I like that, with the March, this window being the window where like supernatural visions are happening. So it seems that it's going from visions to supernatural occurrences. The living man was clutching a horrible stone idol of unknown origin, about a foot in height, regarding whose nature authorities of Sydney University and the Royal Society and Museum in College Street all professed complete bafflement, in which the survivor says he found in the cabin of the yacht in a small carved shrine of common pattern. This man, after recovering his senses, told an exceedingly strange story of piracy and slaughter. He is Gustaf Johansen, a Norwegian of some intelligence, and had been second mate of the two-masted schooner Emma of Auckland, which sailed for Callao February 20th with a complement of 11 men. The Emma, he says, was delayed and thrown widely south of her course by the great storm of March 1st, and on March 22nd, in south latitude 49 degrees, measure 15-1, west latitude 28, measure 34, encountered the Alert, manned by a queer and evil-looking crew of Kanakas and half-castes, being ordered peremptorily to turn back. Captain Collins refused, whereupon the strange crew began to fire savagely and without warning upon the schooner, with a peculiarly heavy battery of brass cannon forming part of the yacht's equipment. The Emma's men showed fight, says the survivor, and thought the schooner began to sink from shots beneath the waterline. They managed to heave alongside their enemy and board her, grappling with the savage crew on the yacht's deck and being forced to kill them all, the number being slightly superior because of their particularly abhorrent and desperate, though rather clumsy mode of fighting. 3 of the Emma's men, including Captain Collins and First Mate Green, were killed, and the remaining 8 under Second Mate Johansen proceeded to navigate the captured yacht, going ahead in their original direction to see if any reason for their ordering back had existed. The next day it appears they raised the land and landed on a small island, although none is known to exist in that part of the ocean. And 6 of the men somehow died ashore, though Johansen is queerly reticent about this part of his story and speaks only of their falling into rock chasms. Later, it seems he and one companion boarded the yacht and tried to manage her, but were beaten about by the storm on April 2nd. From the time till this rescue on the 12th, the man remembers little and does not even recall when William Bridley, his companion, died. Bryden's death reveals no apparent cause and was probably due to excitement or exposure. Cable advice from Dunedin report that the Alert was well known there as an island trader and bore an evil reputation along the waterfront. It was owned by a curious group of half-castes who frequent meetings and night trips to the wood attracted no little curiosity, and it had set sail in great haste just after the storm and earth tremors of March 1st. Our Auckland correspondent gives the Emma and her crew an excellent reputation, and Johansen is described as a sober and worthy man. The Admiralty will institute an inquiry on the whole matter beginning tomorrow, at which every effort will be made to induce Johansen to speak more freely than he has done hitherto. Before we continue, I like how there's shades of Dagon in it, with the whole island that doesn't exist, the island that, rose up and then rose back into the waters, and shades of the temple in this, and again, people being born by nature's fury itself to locations. The water's currents command them, and they have no control of where they're going. Like, this story has a lot of elements just coming together from other Lovecraft stories. This was all together with the picture of the hellish image, but what a train of ideas it started in my mind. Here were new treasuries of data on Cthulhu cult, and evidence that it had strange interests at sea as well as on land. What motive prompted the hybrid crew to order back the Emma as they sailed about with their hideous idol? What was unknown island on which 6 of Emma's crew had died, and about which the mate Johansen was so secretive? What had the Vice Admiralty investigation brought out? And what was known of noxious cult of Dunedin? And most marvelous of all, what deep and more than natural linkage of dates was this which gave a malign and now undeniable significance to the various turns of events so carefully noted by my uncle? March 1st through March 1st off February 28th, according to the international dateline, the earthquake and storm had come. From Dunedin, the alert had Noisemer crew and had darted eagerly forth, as if imperiously summoned. And on the other side of the earth, poets and artists had begun to dream of strange, dank, cyclopean city, whilst a young sculptor had molded in his sleep the form of the dreaded Cthulhu. March 23rd, the crew of the Emma landed on the unknown island and left 6 men dead. And on that date, the dream of the sensitive men assumed a heightened vividness, and the darkness of the dread of the giant monster's malign pursuit. Whilst an architect had gone mad and a sculptor had lapsed suddenly into delirium. And what's of this storm in April 2nd, the date on which all dreams of the dank city ceased and Wilcox emerged unharmed from the bondage of the strange fever? What of all this? And of those hints of the old Castro about the sunken star-born old ones, their coming reign, their faithful cult, and their master of dreams? Was I tottering on the brink of cosmic horrors beyond man's powers to bear? If so, they must be horrors of mind alone, for in some way the 2nd of April had put a stop to whatever monstrous menace had begun its siege on mankind's soul. Was it an island or was it Cthulhu? No idea. The evening after a day of hurried cabling and arranging, I bade my host adieu, and took a train to San Francisco. In less than a month, I was in Dundine, where, however, I found that little was known of the strange cult members who had lingered in the old sea taverns. Waterfront scum was far too common for special mention, though there was vague talk about one inland trip these mongrels had made, during which faint drumming and red flame were noted in the distant hill. In Auckland, I learned that Johansen had returned with yellow hair turned white after the perfunctory and inclusive questioning at Sydney, and had thereafter sold his cottage in Westry and sailed with his wife to his old home in Oslo. Of his stirring experience he would tell his friends no more, and he had told the Admiralty officials, and all they could do was give me his Oslo address. After I went to Sydney and talked profitlessly with seamen and members of the Vice Admiralty Corps, I saw the Alert, now sold and in commercial use at Circular Quay in Sydney Cove, but gained nothing from its non-committal bulk. The crouching image of the cuttlefish head, dragon body, scaly wings, and hieroglyphed pedestal was preserved in the museum at Hyde Park, and I studied it long and well, finding it a thing of balefully exquisite workmanship, and with the same utter mystery, terrible antiquity, and unearthly strangeness of material which I had noted in Legrasse's smaller specimen. Geologists, the curator told me, had found it a monstrous puzzle, for they vowed that the world held no rock like it. Then thought with a shudder of what old Castro had told Legrasse about the primal great ones. They had come from the stars and had brought their images with them. The cuttlefish comment, as an aside, reminded me that Mass Effect, the Reapers were originally inspired by Eldritch horrors. Then they just made them artificial intelligence that just, was harvesting like organics to make more artificial intelligence. Thanks, Mass Effect 3. Anyways, moving on. Back to focus. Shaken with such mental revolution as I had never known before, I now resolved to visit mate Johansen in Oslo. Sailing for London, I re-embarked at once for the Norwegian capital. Is my head on? Yes. And one autumn day I landed at the trim wharves in the shadow of Egberg. Johansen's address, I discovered, lay in the old town of King Harald Hardrada, which kept alive the name of Oslo during all the centuries that the great city masqueraded as Christiania. I made the brief trip by taxicab and knocked with the palpitant heart at the door of a near and ancient building with plastered front. A sad-faced woman in black answered my summons, and I was stung with disappointment when she told me in halting English that Gustav Johansen was no more. He had not long survived his return, his wife said, for the doings at sea in 1925 had broken him. He had told her no more than he had told the public, but had left a long manuscript of technical matters, he had said, written in English, evidently in order to safeguard her from the perils of casual perusal. During a walk through a narrow lane near the Gothenburg dock, a bundle of papers falling from an attic window had knocked him down. Two Lascar sailors at once helped him to his feet. Before the ambulance could reach him, he was dead. Physicians found no adequate cause for the end, and laid to the heart trouble and a weakened constitution. Now I felt gnawing at my vital that dark terror which will never leave me till I too am at rest, accidentally or otherwise. Persuading the widow that my connection with her husband's technical matters was sufficient to entitle me to his manuscripts, I bore the documents away and began to read on the London boat. It was a simple, rambling thing, a naive sailor's efforts to post facto diary, and strove to recall day by day that last awful voyage. I cannot attempt to transcribe its verbatim in all its cloudiness and redundance, but I will tell its gist enough to show why the sound of the water against the vessel's sides became so unendurable to me that I stopped my ears with cotton. Johansen, thank God, did not know quite all, even though he saw the city and the thing. But I shall never sleep calmly again when I think of the horrors that lurk ceaselessly behind life in the time and in space, and of those unhallowed blasphemies from elder stars which dream beneath the sea, known and favored by nightmare cult already, and eager to loose them on the world whenever another earthquake shall heave their monstrous stone city again to the sun and air. Johansen's voyage had begun just as he told it to the Vice Admiralty. The Emma in ballast, The Emma in ballast had cleared Auckland on February 20th, and had felt the full force of the earthquake-born tempest which must have heaved up the sea bottom, the horrors that filled men's dreams. Once more under control, the ship was making good progress when held up by the Alert on March 22nd. And I could feel the mate's regret as he wrote of her bombardment and sinking, of the swarthy cult fiends of the Alert, who he speaks with significant horror. There was some peculiarly abominable horror about them which made their destruction abominable, which had made their destruction seem almost a duty, and Johansen shows ingenuous wonder at the charge of ruthlessness brought against his party during the proceedings of the court of inquiry. Then, driven ahead by curiosity in their captured yacht, under Johansen's command, the men sight a great stone pillar sticking out of the sea, and in south latitude 47 degrees measure 9, with longitude west longitude 126 degrees measure 43, came upon a coastline of mingled mud, oozed and weedy cyclopean masonry, which can be nothing less than a tangible substance of Earth's supreme terror, the nightmare corpse city of Relay, that was built in the measureless aeons beyond history by the vast lonesome shapes that seeped down from the dark stars. There lay great Cthulhu, and his hordes hidden in green, slimy vaults, sending out at last, after cycles and incalculable, and the thoughts that spread fear to the dreams of the sensitive and called imperiously to the faithful to come on the pilgrimage of liberation and restoration. All this Johansen did not suspect, but God knows he saw soon enough. I suppose that only a single mountain... Gunner, don't... Sorry, when I took the break, my dog, Gunner, came into the room, and he's just now sleeping at my feet. I suppose that only a single mountaintop, the hideous monolith crowned citadel whereon great Cthulhu was buried, actually emerged from the waters. When I think of the extent of all that may be brooding down there, I almost wish to to end myself forthwith. I can't say those words because YouTube. Johansen and his men were awed by the cosmic majesty of this dripping Babylon of elder demons, and must have guessed without guidance that it was nothing of this or any sane planet. At the unbelievable size of the greenish stone blocks, at the dizzying height of the great carven monolith, and at the stupefying identity of the colossal statue and the bas-relief with the queer image found in the shrine of Alert is poignantly visible in every line of the mate's frightened description. Without knowing what futurism is like, Johansen achieved something very close to it and when he spoke of the city. Instead of describing any definite structure or building, he dwells on the broad impression of vast angles and stone surfaces too great to belong to anything right or proper for this earth, and impious with horrible images and hieroglyphs. I mentioned his talk about angles because it suggests something. Wilcox had told me of his awful dreams. He had said that the geometry of the dream place he saw was abnormal, non-Euclidean, and lonesomely redolent of spheres and dimensions apart from ours. Now an unleaded seaman felt the same thing was gazing at the terrible reality. Johansen and his men landed at a sloping mudbank of his monstrous acropolis and clambered slipperily up over titan oozy blocks, which could have been no mortal staircase. The very sun of heaven seemed distorted when viewed through the polarizing miasma welling from the sea-soaked perversions and twisted menace and suspense lurked leering in those crazy, elusive angles of carven rock where a second glance showed concavity after the first showed convexity. Something very like fright had come over all the explorers before anything more definite than rock and ooze and weed was seen. Each would have fled had he not feared the scorn of the others, and it was only half-heartedly that they searched vainly, as it proved, for some portable souvenir to bear away. It was Rodriguez, the Portuguese, who climbed up the foot of the monolith and shouted of what he found. The rest followed him and looked curiously at the immense carved door with the now familiar squid dragon bas relief. It was, Johansson said, like a great barn door, and they all felt that it was a door because that an ornate lintel threshold jams around it, though they could not decide whether it lay flat like a trapdoor or slantwise like the other cellar door. As Wilcox would have said, the geometry of the place was all wrong. One could not be sure, but that the sea and the ground were horizontal, hence the relative position of everything else seemed phantasmally variable. Bryden pushed at the stone in several places without result. Then Donovan felt over it delicately around the edge, pressing each point separately as he went. He climbed interminably along the grotesque stone molding. That is, one would call it climbing if the thing was not, after all, horizontal. And the men wondered how any door in the universe could be so vast. Then, very softly and slowly, a great panel began to give inward at the top, and they saw that it was balanced. Donovan slid or somehow propelled himself downward along the jam and rejoined his fellows, and everyone watched the queer recession of monstrously carved portals. In the fantasy of prismatic distortion, it moved animously in a diagonal way so that all the rules mattered and perspective seemed upset. The aperture was black and with darkness almost material. The tenebrousness, that tenebrousness was indeed a positive quality, for it obscured such parts of the inner walls as ought to have been revealed and actually burst forth like smoke from its eons-long imprisonment, visibly darkening the sun as it slunk away into the sunken and gibbous sky of flapping membranous wings. The odor arising from the newly opened depths was intolerable. The length of quick-eared Hawkins, though he heard a nasty slopping sound down there. Thought he heard a nasty slopping sound down there. Sorry. Everyone listened, and everyone was still listening when it lumbered slobberingly into sight and groping squeezed its gelatinous green immensity through the black doorway into the tainted outside air of the poisoned city of madness. Poor Johansson's handwriting almost gave out when he wrote of this. Of the 6 men who never reached the ship, he thinks 2 perished of pure fright in the cursed instant. The thing cannot be described. There is no language for such abyss of shrieking and immemorable lunacy, such eldritch contradictions of all matter, force and cosmic order. A mountain walked or stumbled. God, what wonder that across the earth great architect went mad, and poor Wilcox raved with fever in the telepathic instant. The thing of the idols, the green, sticky spawn of the stars, had awakened to claim his own. The stars were right again, and what the age-old cult had failed to do by design, a band of innocent sailors had done by accident. After Vigitillions of years, great Cthulhu was loose again and raving for delight. Ravening. Damn it. 3 men were swept up by the flabby claws before anybody turned. God rest them. If there had any rest in the universe, they were Donovan, Guerrera, and Engston. Parker slipped as the other 3 were plunging frenziedly over endless vistas and green-crusted rock to the boat. And Johansson swears he was swallowed up by an angle of masonry which shouldn't have been there. An angle which was acute but behaved as if it was obtuse. So only Bryden and Johansson reached the boat and pulled desperately for the alert as the mountainous monstrosity flopped down the slimy stones and hesitated, floundering at the edge of the water. Steam had not been suffered to go down entirely, despite the departure of all hands for the shore, and it was work of only a few moments of feverish rushing up and down between the wheels and engines to get the alert underway. Slowly, amidst the distorted horrors of that indescribable scene, she began to churn the lethal waters, and whilst on the masonry of that charnel shore that was not of earth, the titan thing from the stars slavered and gibbered like Polypheme and cursing the fleeing ship of Odysseus. Then, bolder with the stories of Cyclops, great Cthulhu slid greasily into the water and began to pursue with vast wave-rising strokes of the cosmic potency. Bryden looked back and went mad, laughing shrilly as he kept on laughing at intervals till death found him one night in the cabin whilst Johansson was wandering deliriously. But Johansson had not given out yet. Knowing that the thing could surely overtake the alert until steam was fully up, he resolved on a desperate chance, and setting the engine for full speed, ran lightning-like on deck, reversed the wheel. There was a mighty eddying and foaming of the noisome brine, and as the steam mounted higher and higher, the brave Norwegian drove his vessel head on against the pursuing jelly, which rose above the unclean froth like the stern of a demon galleon. The awful squid head with writhing feelers came nearer, but up and the bowsprit of the sturdy yacht, but Johansson drove on relentlessly. There was a bursting as of an exploding bladder, a slushy nastiness as of a cloven sunfish, a stench as of 1,000 open graves, and a sound that the chronicler would not put on paper. For an instant the ship was befouled by acrid and blinding green cloud, and then there was only a venomous seething at Aston, where God in heaven, the scattered plasticity of the nameless sky spawn, was nebulously recombining in its hateful original form, whilst its distance widened every second as the alert gained impetus from the mounting steam. That was all. After Johansson only brooded over the idol in the cabin and attended to a few matters of food for himself and the laughing maniac by his side. He did not try to navigate after the first bold flight, for the reaction had taken something out of his soul. Then came the storm on April 2nd and the gathering of the clouds about his consciousness. There is a sense of spectacle whirling through liquid gulfs of infinity, of dizzying rides through reeling universes on the comet's tail, and of hysterical plunges from the pit to the moon and from the moon back again to the pit. All livened by an cachinnating chorus of the distorted, hilarious elder gods and the green bat-winged mocking imps of Tartarus. Oh. Out of the dream came rescue the vigilant, the Vice Admiralty Corps, the streets of Dunedin, and the long voyage back home to the old house by Edgeborough. He could not tell, they would think him mad. He would write of what he knew before death came. But his wife must not guess. Death would not be a boon if only it could blot out memories. Death would be a boon if only it could blot out memories. That was the document I read, and now I have placed it in the tin box beside the bas-relief and papers of Professor Engel. With it shall go this record of mine, with test of my own sanity, wherein it's pieced together, that with I hope may never be pieced together again. I have looked upon all the universe has to hold of horror, and even the skies of spring and flowers of summer must ever afterwards be poison to me. For I do not think my life will be long. As my uncle went, as poor Johansen went, as I shall go. I know too much. The cult still lives. Cthulhu still lives, too. I suppose, again, in the chasm of stone which has shielded him since the sun was young. His accursed city is sunken once more, for the Vigilance sailed over the spot after April storm. But his ministers on earth still bellow and prance and slay around the idol-capped monolith in lonely places. He must have been trapped by the sinking whilst within his black abyss, or else the world would by now be screaming with fright and frenzy. Who knows the end? What has risen may sink, and what has sunk may rise. Lonesomeness waits and dreams in the deep, and decay spreads over the tottering cities of men. A time will come, but I must not and cannot think. Let me pray that, if I do not survive this manuscript, my executors may put caution before audacity, and see that it meets no other eye. And then that's the end of it. Ooh. And that's the story. Ooh. I'm happy that we, before getting to this, read a lot of other Lovecraft. Because it really does seem like a lot of other Lovecraft primes you for it, like the whole city rising from the deep. The whole city's underwater is primed by the temple, and the city rising up is primed by Dagon, as I already said. But even the fact that like the storm coming to like resink the island is also in Dagon. Though Dagon is a different city. But I really like that. I'm really happy for that. I did not expect to read it all in one stream. I thought that was going to be a lot longer. We're going to have to find something else to read. Ooh, probably more Lovecraft. Because this was a lot shorter than I thought. And we're actually probably going to be playing some Lovecraft games for the rest of the month too. But I really, really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed just how it was just a nice culmination of a lot of other works, both directly and indirectly. Directly with the name, with the nameless city, and how they just pretty much reference that location, but also just, again, all the other things that you're primed at. There's also kind of almost like a feel of the King in Yellow. I know that's Chambers, not Lovecraft, but the fact that there's hints that the character is suffering from a madness as he looks more and more into these things. That he, even though he's not experiencing any of these things directly, that he's only experienced all of these matters indirectly through either the idols or the stories being told, that madness is even slipping into him, that even on a secondary source, it is an encroaching darkness that consumes all. Kind of similar to how the King in Yellow is this mimetic horror. There's a element of mimetic horror in this story as well. So it's all really well put together. It has wonderful pacing. I like how when they go through Cthulhu, it says Cthulhu just starts reforming. I do really like that, just visual. That it almost seems at first like they do something to Cthulhu, and it seems almost at first they do something to Cthulhu because it seems that they just rend through him, and then he just starts reforming. He just starts, you know, being like, okay, that was neat. It's a question of even if they hurt Cthulhu, if Cthulhu is just like, what's that? I don't know what that is, so I'm just gonna like disperse around it. I don't want to get hit by that thing. Ooh. It was really nice, and I can't wait to continue reading more, probably Lovecraft as we go along. I'm probably gonna do, what is it, Sucker for Love next week. I'll probably do that instead of reading, which is the Cthulhu dating game. But that's for next week. Thank you for joining us. Let me look for a place to link you guys out to. Ooh. Let's, here? Where would I want to... Actually, I'm going to put the BGM back on. And turn off the desktop audio. It's always so late. It's always like the same 5 people I can link out to when it's this late. I haven't linked out to Kiki in a long time, I think, so I'm gonna link out to Kiki. Yeah, we can definitely read more Lovecraft, because I thought that was gonna be a lot longer, but because that wasn't as long as I thought, I think we can definitely fit in more. Also, I mentioned in the Mouth of Madness, we're not gonna watch it this week, but on the Discord, we'll probably watch that next week. This week, I think we'll watch Underwater. Underwater is a Lovecraft-inspired story. Not the best name. They should have called it like The Call of the Deep or something for like a nice nice illusion, but whatever. But Underwater is pretty good. It's a little more hopeful than a lot of Eldritch stories are, but it's still a nice Eldritch story. It's about people who literally go to the bottom of the ocean, and then they dig too deep, and from the bottom of the ocean, things happen. And it has a nice unraveling to like the mystery of like the horror that they have before them. So we'll have that probably on this week for the Discord. That'll be on Saturday. Ooh. But there's the link to Kiki, and let me look for a link for Twitch for you beautiful people. I hope you like this stream as much as I like doing it. I always get turned around. Oh wow, like nobody's online. No, nobody that I'm following is online, and I don't really know where to send you guys off to, so I'm guessing this will be a dead end on Twitch. My apologies, but I would like to say to have a great day, a wonderful life. We'll be back tomorrow to finish The Amazing Red Warrior. And always remember, don't lose your head. But I don't think there's really anything else I need to say. I think I've gotten everything. Just have a good night, everyone. Sleep well. And hopefully don't have dreams of nameless cities and ancient gods. And if you do, That's a you problem. I don't know. Good night.